Now, as we begin the notes in the War of 1812, it's also known as the Second War for Independence. And it's important that students understand that there's a great similarity between this war and our Revolutionary War. So the essential question, how are the two similar? Remember, similarities don't need to be exactly the same. There needs to be a relationship between the two. And of course, the obvious similarity between the War of 1812 and the Revolution is we've got the same enemy. We've got the same person or group of people that we're fighting against. So as we begin to see similar situations, be thinking about those as you look forward to answering this essential question. Remember, essential questions really should be answered in 3 or more sentences using what we call the race format. That is, you're going to take the question and you're going to turn the question into a statement as you begin to answer the question. So one of the things about these notes that's going to be kind of different is that we're going to see a timeline. And the timeline is meant to show you that the war really is a short war in terms of the number of years. Whenever you see a red subtitle, the way you see this, so this red subtitle right here, this indicates a new subtopic. So keep that in mind as you're working. The subtopics are going to be in red, and if it's not red, then it's not a subtopic. So we're going to start with the reasons and go back to really the causes of the War of 1812. And there were primarily 3 reasons. So think of the 3 reasons, okay, that you might have remembered from your previous notes on the causes. But the first reason was that there's this war going on between France and Britain, and the result is that both countries really are preventing us from trade. And so there are trade issues. And we blame those trade issues mostly on the British. The French were not really the ones preventing us from trading as often as we saw the British doing the exact same thing. And that's because the British are doing something else in addition to preventing us from trading. And that is, they always suspect, the British suspect we're working with the French, and the French suspect we're working with the British. But when they attack American merchant ships and prevent them from trading, they're also impressing American sailors. So we call this impressment. And impressment is the process by which the British would take American sailors off of American ships, accusing them of being runaway British sailors, and they would make them work in the British Navy. And in particular, this was happening on the British side because the British were in deep need of sailors. They were in the midst of a war with France, the Napoleonic Wars, and because of that, there's a need for those sailors. So they're taking these Americans, some of which they suspect of being runaway British sailors who have left the British Navy, and they're making them work then on these British ships. The third reason, if you remember, was that we had some Indian problems in the Northwest Territories. There was a Indian chief, Tecumseh, and he was sort of unifying the Indian tribes in the Northwest Territory and encouraged them to attack settlers. What we discovered, though, at the Battle of Tippecanoe is that, in fact, the British are supplying those Indians. So they're supplying Indians, and what they're doing with those supplies is, remember, that they are encouraging attacks on settlers. And so it's important to recognize that when we look at the problems we have, they tend to point to the British. It's not the French. The French are a problem, yes, but they are not the problem that the British are. And so the reasons or the causes of, maybe a better way of putting this is, the causes of the War of 1812 are as follows. So remember, red, that means that it's a subtopic. This is sort of a review, the reasons here, review of the causes of the war. And so as we go now forward, keep in mind the idea of the red subtopics. So now here's our new subtopic. It says U.S. Navy rules the seas, and let's talk about why we're unprepared for war. If you remember that under Thomas Jefferson, there was this emphasis on rebuilding the Navy. And the emphasis on rebuilding the Navy was because of the fact that Thomas Jefferson had to deal with the Barbary Coast pirates. So those Barbary Coast pirates were brought up in class because it causes this kind of conflict. Jefferson really isn't a big pro-military person. He'd rather not see the money spent on things like that. But as president, he recognizes there's a problem. You've got Barbary Coast pirates, and without the military, the naval power of the United States to deal with those pirates, we're going to continue to have to shell out huge amounts of money. He'd rather spend that money on a navy then that protects merchants rather than just give it to pirates, because then next year we have to give it to them again as tribute. So during Jefferson's time as president, the Navy gets rebuilt, but what doesn't get rebuilt is the Army. The Army really has been sort of, it was sort of left, okay, undeveloped, untaken care of. It was just not. It was not something that was built and maintained, and that we added numbers to, and we made sure that the weapons were working well, and it was sort of left. And it had been left for a long time, all through John Adams, all through Thomas Jefferson. And now James Madison is president of the United States during the War of 1812. He's left with this army that really just isn't ready to fight, but it's not ready for another reason. And that is, we don't have leadership really to speak of. We lack military leadership. And we lack that military leadership because of the fact that the people that really were our military leaders are either dead or just way too old to be military leaders. And we haven't had a war to speak of where these people that are the military leaders have gotten experience. So they're young, they're inexperienced, they haven't been to war yet, and the result is that they really aren't prepared to lead the United States Army. And we do have a Navy, but our Navy is rather small. So as much as we do have a Navy from Jefferson, the Navy is small. It was suitable to deal with the pirates, but it's certainly not going to be suitable to deal with the problem of the British, which have a very large Navy. So next, in our notes here, let's talk a little bit about some of the reasons why it is that we ruled the seas at the beginning of the war. British ships are a lot bigger than ours, and not just in terms of size, but they have a lot more cannons on them. The result is they're rather slow. They don't turn fast. Our ships are faster, okay, and that's because our ships are smaller. I mean that they're smaller, they're more maneuverable, right? Most of our Navy were, in fact, privateers. So one of the things that happens early in the war is that President Madison says, well, we haven't got a large Navy. We've got a Navy, but we haven't got enough of a Navy. So he actually has Congress sign a law. He signs it into law, and he says, the law says basically that we're going to allow Americans to serve as privateers, so merchant ships convert themselves into military ships, and that when they attack the British, whatever they seize, whatever they take, they can keep, and that's their payment done. Right? So they're, in effect, they're legalized pirates. That's what they are. Now, most of our battles are going to be one-on-one. One British ship, one American ship, and you're going to see why that's probably an advantage. Because if our ships are more maneuverable, the result is that we really can kind of come in and go out and move around the British ships, and it makes it difficult for them to hit a smaller target that's moving more quickly. One of the more important ships that actually became famous during the Barbary Coast Wars and now becomes famous all over again during the War of 1812 is the USS Constitution. And it becomes famous because a cannonball bounces off her hull. That's the side of the ship. And so she gets a name, and the nickname is Old Ironsides. Right now, the ship is not made of iron, and the ship doesn't have metal sides in the sense that we think of armor. It does have brass plating along the bottom of the ship where the barnacles would normally attach, and that was meant to really protect the ship. But the ship really makes a name for itself, and as a result of this ship and the success of the Americans, the British begin to patrol in groups. And the patrolling in groups means, instead of it being a 1-to-1 ratio, one American ship versus one British ship, now it is one American ship versus, say, 2 or 3 British ships. And the result is that there's no way we can compete with this. And so the British are, again, going to control the oceans despite our best efforts. We just don't have the necessary Navy and the firepower that the British have. Now, what's also interesting about the USS Constitution is it happens to be still in existence. It is docked, I believe it is in Boston, and it is still part of the U.S. Navy. It is still run by and maintained by the U.S. Navy. And so here we have a boat that's 240 years old, and it is, in fact, still active, and it's in good shape. A very famous battleship from the War of 1812. We're going to now move into the Battle of Lake Erie, and notice we went from 1812 and now we're into 1813. This is about mid-year. It's about June of 1813. The Battle of Lake Erie is going to be an attempt for by the British to invade from the north. So think of the United States kind of like a box, right? We've got the East Coast. We've got essentially the Mississippi River over here, although our country goes all the way over to the Rocky Mountains, remember? And we've got the Great Lakes up here, and we've got the Gulf of Mexico down here. Well, the British are going to try and invade from the north. They will, later on we'll see, try and invade from the east. And they will then also try and invade from the south. They're going to make all three attempts. So we're going to look at all three of them separately. The Battle of Lake Erie. So this is the guy who's in charge at Lake Erie. His name is Oliver Hazard Perry. And he's actually responsible for building the fleet on Lake Erie. There were no ships on Lake Erie. So what he's going to do is he's going to be given 400 soldiers. Those soldiers are going to come from the commander of the army in the Northwest Territory, William Henry Harrison. And he's going to provide Perry with these 400 soldiers that Perry then has to train on how to be sailors. But more than that, he has to get them to build the fleet, to cut down the trees, to saw them into boards, to put these things together, to learn how to make sails, to learn how to make ropes, and all those things that are required to build the ship, but also then to sail the ship into battle. His battle flag says, "Don't give up the ship." It really is a statement to his determination to succeed or to die failing. Don't give up the ship. He leads his first boat into battle, and his boat gets destroyed. He then leads a second boat into battle and is victorious. And the result is that he then sends a victory note off to William Henry Harrison. And it simply says, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." And he signs it O.H. Perry. A very short note, right? A very swift statement of what he has really kind of succeeded in doing. Let's look really quick at what happens to Perry, because this story saying one boat goes into battle, another boat goes into battle, this could be, I think, somewhat confusing. So what I want you to understand is that when battles occur, there very often are battle plans. Both sides will make plans. And the way this can be described is we have, for instance, Perry's boat right here. It's in blue. So these are the American ships over here. And Perry tells his men, "You are assigned specifically to another British ship." Well, Perry's ship that he's assigned to is this one back here. So this is the American captain of all of the American ships, and this is the British, where the British captain is, of all of the British ships. And Perry's supposed to attack this guy. So when he goes into battle, he has to cruise through the mass of all these other ships, and in the process, he ends up getting himself destroyed. But what he also notices that as he begins this process, he looks back, and his men are sitting there. Those ships aren't moving. And part of the reason was the British did something that they were very fond of doing, and that is they did a little bit of psychological warfare. Before the battle started, they lit off all of their cannons all at the same time, and they sent this massive sound wave towards the American ships. And that massive sound wave caused the American ships to rattle and creak and moan. And the men that were on them, being inexperienced soldiers, not really being sailors for very long, didn't really understand what was happening. And this is where we get the term "shiver me timbers." It comes from that moaning sound and creaking sound that is caused really by a ship reacting to, I guess is the best way to say it, reacting to those sound waves that it's being hit by. So as Perry goes into battle, again, his ship gets destroyed. And so we see here now, Perry's back here at the very back end of this whole thing. His ship is pretty well messed up, right? And his ship is on fire. And so he is going to get into, wrong color for fire, sorry about that. But he's going to get into his a rowboat, and he's going to row all the way back to the American ships. Well, by the time he gets back there, the British have kind of rearranged their configuration. They're hoping to go around the American fleet and to prevent the American fleet from really going anywhere. When Perry gets back to the rest of his fleet, he orders the captain of one ship to get off of the ship, and Perry gets on. And Perry now takes that ship into battle, And his men, realizing how Perry's been successful, they begin to follow him into battle. And he gives the order that these ships are to not wait for orders to fire, but he says, take your time, gentlemen, aim for the sails, aim for the rudders, don't worry about the ships, don't worry about the men. Put the ships out of commission. And one after the other, British ship is going to have its sails and its rudders destroyed in the next hour, as the American ships are going to go up the middle, and they're going to come around the outside, and they're going to make sure that these ships are disabled, and the British ships are going to give up one after the other. And this is the reason why he is able to send that note. You can see here, this is a very famous picture or painting of Perry, okay? And he's being rowed back through this mess of ships that are fighting. And it's really kind of an interesting battle, because this really is an example of a single-handed how one man really does save the day. Now we're looking at the war in the East, and notice how there's two events here. There's two different subtopics. One of them is the attack on Washington. The other one is the bombardment of Fort McHenry. And we're going to look at the attack on Washington first. So when the British are going to approach Washington, D.C., this is Chesapeake Bay here, the British are going to approach in a rather unusual way. They're going to move their way up this kind of little branch here of the Chesapeake Bay. They're going to land. They're going to march their men upon Washington, D.C. There's a small battle that takes place at Blandensburg before they actually get to Washington, D.C. They're then going to, after they take care of Washington, D.C., the goal is to then move on Baltimore. And you can see the red arrow here. Okay? And that's going to be important in just a little bit. So they land at Washington, and what do? Well, they end up burning Washington to the ground. They burn it up. They light the whole city on fire. And they do this because at the beginning of the war, something that I didn't talk about, but at the beginning of the war, there was an attack launched on Canada by the United States. And that attack went into Canada, and the Americans that were part of that attack burned the Canadian Parliament to the ground. And we ended up getting really destroyed in that effort to take over Canada, and we were pushed back out of Canada. Well, the British haven't forgotten it, so when they attack Washington, they burn our capital to the ground, the same way we burned their capital to the ground. Might teach you something about war. Madison escapes up the Potomac River, so the president, along with his advisors, goes further up the Potomac River and really tries to get out of the way. So Madison is going to go that direction, away from Washington, D.C. And his wife, Dolly Madison, is going to be very instrumental in making sure that certain artifacts in the White House are going to be preserved before it gets burned down. So, for instance, a copy of the Constitution. So Dolly Madison down here, Dolly Madison saves a copy of the Constitution. She saves a copy of the Declaration of Independence. She saves copies of important treaties that have been signed and important laws that have been signed by the president over the last, well, not just Madison, but previous presidents as well. On top of it, she's going to save a very important picture of George Washington, actually the only portrait ever painted of George Washington as president. And that picture is in a giant frame, which is about the size of the smartboard in the classroom. And she's going to have it the frame torn apart in order to get the picture out, because the frame itself weighs about 300 pounds. All these things are loaded into carts, and she's going to have that wheeled out of the city to save it. Well, as the British finish their job in Washington, and they begin to make this trek on the way to Baltimore, something happens right here that you need to add to this page of notes. And that is that the British report and Americans report that a massive hurricane came in. And that hurricane included lightning. And of course, an incredible amount of wind. But it also, at one point, a tornado hits. And so the British that are marching actually experience something that they almost describe like the hand of God. They said it's as if God got angry. We burned down the city of Washington, because as we're marching from Washington to Baltimore, all of a sudden this hurricane hits, and men can't stand up. They can't walk. They're being pushed all over the place. Some men are being thrown to the ground. Some of them are being thrown into the air. When the tornado hits, they report that cannons have been lifted off the ground and thrown into trees. And everything is scattered all over the place. This army has just been destroyed by nature. And on top of it, all the rain that drops makes it incredibly difficult, even after the hurricane has left, to continue marching. That rain is just dumped on this massive area, and this place is so muddy now and filled with puddles and things like that, then it makes it difficult to march through the area. So now we have the bombardment of Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry was that second thing that was on the timeline, right close to the attack on Washington, D.C. Fort McHenry protects the entrance to Baltimore Harbor. So this is the reason why the two are connected. Those British soldiers that were marching upon Baltimore, this is the fort that protects the harbor that goes up into the city. And the fort itself that's there is flying the largest American flag that was made up to this point. It was something that was made specifically for the fort, and the purpose of the flag was really to identify the fort. The commander of the fort wanted to make sure that the British saw the fort and they knew where the fort was as they approached the city. He wants the focus to be on the fort, not the city where the civilians are, where women and children are. This flag was kept after the battle. This is a picture of that flag. You can see the marks on it where the damage was done from the bombs and things that flew through it. What's interesting also is that this flag is on display in the Smithsonian. As you walk in the front door of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., there's this giant flag, and it is in fact the flag that flew over Fort McHenry at the city of Baltimore during the War of 1812. The attack. So the British are going to attack using very new technology. They've got rockets, and they're going to launch those rockets. Somewhere around 700 rockets are going to be launched. The main purpose of rockets is because the rockets are going to make huge amounts of light, and they're going to make horrible sounds. So again, this is another example of what we call psychological warfare. It's really meant to freak people out. Now, on the other hand, you've got these carcass fireballs, right? These are exploding bombs. So they're hollow, they're filled with gunpowder, and then what they do is they stick in there a fuse. The fuse is got a specific measurement. It is 1 inch of fuse is equal to 1 second in terms of burning. So if you need that thing to fly for 5 seconds or 7 seconds, you would give it a 5-inch or a 7-inch fuse. It would light the fuse, light off the cannon, and out comes this bomb. And you'll notice that in the picture, what's interesting is these ships are launching these things, and they have this kind of arc as they fall on their target, right? And that's the way these were. These were not a typical cannon. They're not shooting them horizontally. They're shooting them up into the air into this arc, and that's why they got to have a fuse that kind of delays it. Now, this is brand new technology, and it's really not reliable. And so many of these bombs are going to blow up in midair, or they're going to hit the ground, roll around, and then blow up. And so it's really an unreliable thing, unfortunately, for the British. So how does Fort McHenry survive? Well, there really are 3 things that we need to talk about. First thing we need to talk about is the fact that Fort McHenry is a very well-defended fort. And that's the result of the fact that the fort is star-shaped. It allows the fort to have so many different angles from which the men can point their guns or from cannons can point that it makes this a very difficult fort to attack without being shot at by somebody who's on the wall. The second thing that protects the fort is that the fort is actually an earthen fort. And this earthen fort, being made out of dirt, has become nothing but a big pile of mud because of all the rain. And the result is that these exploding bombs sort of get absorbed when they come in. Many of them go right into the mud, and then they explode and just throws mud everywhere rather than throwing the metal from these bombs, because this is a hollow piece of metal. When it explodes, those pieces of metal go flying everywhere. It's called shrapnel, and the mud prevents it. And then number 3, and it really has to do with this picture here. This is a diagram of Baltimore, and this is where the harbor is in front of Baltimore. This is all water around here, right? So all this is water. And then eventually, as you go further this way, it goes out into the Chesapeake Bay. The city of Baltimore is back here. And the Fort McHenry sits right here where the harbor sort of enters in back by Baltimore. Now, remember, we had all those We had all those soldiers that were marching in from Washington, D.C. this way. Well, they've been prevented, right? We have some, British will send some guys this direction and try and get them to come in. The problem is this entire area is a swamp. And so that's going to prevent them from really getting in and making any headway to Baltimore. There is an attempt by the British to land men this way, and they begin to march them this way. But the problem is that with that, their general ends up getting shot, and he's killed, and so the attack that comes that direction is going to be a failure because of lack of leadership. So the result really is that the British only have one place, and that is right here. They've got to go past this fort and get in here. But the fort stands in the way. And what they did in the fort, this is number 3, what they did was they sunk ships right here. They took ships from up here and they sunk them right there. And they created literally a wall of ships that were on the bottom of the bay that the British couldn't go past. If they'd gone past them, they would have gotten caught on them. Then the fort itself would have been able to fire upon them, or they would have gotten caught and they would have sunk. So those sunken ships really did form a wall, and that wall protects not only the fort, but protects the city. It causes the British to have to sit out here in the harbor and to launch their attack via these bombs on Fort McHenry, one after the other, one after the other. 1,500 of these exploding bombs. And this is why we get this thing called the national anthem, because it's during this whole time that this guy, Francis Scott Key, is sitting on a boat. And he's sitting on a boat because he happens to be a lawyer, and he's been called out by the British, and he's asked to negotiate a prisoner exchange. And while he's there negotiating, the British tell him, well, you can't leave. You got to stay. Why? Because the bombardment's starting and it's too dangerous. I can't row you back to shore now. And so while he's there, he writes down this poem, and this really is a poem. Wasn't meant to be a song at the time. When you look at it, it says, again, "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleam?" Do you see this morning what we saw last night? And what was that thing we saw? Well, we saw this thing that had broad stripes and bright stars. The flag, in other words. That through the perilous fight over the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. We saw this flag over the walls of the fort. We saw it, the ramparts. And then as the night came, what happened was this. And the rockets' red glare and the bombs bursting in air, they gave proof through the night that the flag was still there. And every once in a while, one of those big rockets would explode in the midair, or the bomb would burst in air, and there'd be this flash of light, and we'd see the flag, and then it would disappear. And this is what he's describing. And he's saying, is it still there? Because if the flag is still there, well, that's victory. The flag is gone. That's defeat. He wants to know, is the flag still there? And in the morning, the flag is still there. The British have spent their 25 hours and 1,500 bombs, and they've accomplished much of nothing. War in the South. We got two different things happening here. We've got the Battle of New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent. We're going to start with the Battle of New Orleans, and we have this guy by the name of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is going to lead the troops at New Orleans. He's sent down there to lead them. He has got a nickname. His nickname is Old Hickory. He is known as a guy that does not break. He is strong by a piece of wood. Hickory is known for the fact that it's flexible, but does not break. And why do the British want New Orleans? Because they want to control the Mississippi River. By controlling the Mississippi River, that would give them the opportunity to, imagine this is the river here. Here's New Orleans down at the bottom. If the British can control the Mississippi, they can launch attacks into the United States from almost anywhere along the Mississippi River. So they want to make sure that they have this river. Jackson's army is made up of a bunch of different people. In particular, the townspeople of New Orleans are going to come out and they're going to help. But also, there's a bunch of frontiersmen that are going to come out. They're mostly people from Tennessee. They happen to be more like mountain men. They come out and they are dressed in coonskin caps, and they're dressed in natural skin, fur skin coats and so on. They're big supporters of Jackson. We also have Creoles that come out. They are local people that live around New Orleans, and we have pirates. Pirates that have actually sided with Jackson because, of course, they don't want to side with the British. The British would just simply hang them. And so they figure they got a better chance with Jackson. Jackson builds a bunch of walls, and he builds those walls perpendicular to the Mississippi River. So we've got, for instance, if you look on the map here, we've got here a canal, and there's a wall that is right behind the canal. And he builds his walls right behind the canals. The canals were already there. And he builds them perpendicular. So as the British come in, they're going to have to deal with the fact they have to get across the canal, then they have to get over the wall before they even get to the Americans. Before they reach the wall, all the British officers are killed. What's happened is these frontiersmen have brought in these long rifles, and they use these long rifles to take down all the officers before they even reach the walls. The British fail for a variety of reasons because of the lack of leadership. Remember, their officers are dead. That lack of leadership is going to be a problem for the soldiers. It's also because of how complicated their plan was. And being that their plan was complicated, it meant when their leadership was gone, the men didn't understand how to implement the plan. But they also forgot the ladders. Ladders needed to get over the walls. Somebody left them at the back of the battlefield. And as a result, 2,000 British casualties versus 100 American casualties. When the battle's over, Americans will go out and help the British clean up the battlefield. And the British are going to comment that a vast majority of their officers that have been shot were actually shot through the head. These men right here, these frontiersmen, they are in effect sharpshooters. And they've done some very deadly work in the process of dealing with these British officers. What we don't realize is that the Treaty of Ghent was actually signed before. It was signed in 1815 in December, whereas the Battle of New Orleans takes place in January of 15. So the Treaty of Ghent, 1814, my mistake, in December. And it is signed in Belgium. And so it takes about 1.5 months for it to get to the United States. And this is the reason why they didn't hear about it. All this treaty did was it ended the war with Britain, and it simply said that we are going to stop fighting, which makes sense, okay? But we also have to return any land taken. So we're not really going to have a treaty that's going to do much more than that. Notice that something isn't dealt with, and that is the issue of impressment. Impressment is not part of this treaty because impressment ended. And it ended when the Napoleonic Wars ended. And the Napoleonic Wars ended just before the Battle of New Orleans. In fact, the soldiers that were at New Orleans on the British side were actually men that had defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, and they were sent to New Orleans to work on the Americans. So the treaty is actually signed, in fact, before the last battle, but we don't hear about it because of how far away it is. Now, as a result, the effects of the war are pretty simple. There's an increased feeling of patriotism. There is this firm belief in our country, a firm belief not only in our country, but in our Constitution, and our Constitution's ability to guide us and direct us even in times of crisis. And then on top of that, there's greater national unity. We found out that one of the groups of people that really opposed the war at the beginning were the Federalists. The Federalist Party is going to become non-existent at the end of the war. Those who supported the Federalist Party and those who argued against the war are seen as traitors, and so the Federalist Party disappears. And the United States at this point now sees itself as really equal to all the countries of the world. Equal in terms of its economic strength, in terms of its military strength, in terms of its ability as a country to handle problems. There's this sense of equality that now exists. Americans have a great deal of confidence. As a matter of fact, the next sort of time period following the war has got a unique name. We don't see this very often. The time period after the War of 1812 was called the Era of Good Feelings. That time where we're loving life. we're enjoying things. We've been successful, and we can put things back together again, but we're making improvements, and we're making the country a better place. So the War of 1812 was something that was very similar to the Revolution. Your job is to figure out how, but it's also important to recognize that there's some significant things that happen here. We've got our national anthem as a result of it. We also got General Jackson, he's going to become president because of this. He becomes a war hero here, and he becomes president later on. And on top of it all, we've got some great effects that are going to be positive things for our country. The idea that we are really confident in our government, in our Constitution. We love our country. There's a great deal of unity, and we are seeing ourselves now as equals in the world.